I'm recording. All right. So this is me. If you need to get a hold of me for any reason, for anything, I've got my contact information there, and I'm glad to help you with anything, agents or Extension Master Gardener volunteers, so you can get up with me later. And I wanted to bring up the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic site, because this is, in visiting this yesterday, noticed that there's all sorts of really great resources here that both agents and volunteers can take advantage of. So if you just visit the site and you scan down, they've got a tour of the lab, and they've got a game in the disease clinic. So it's one of those places that I think my sister had worked on years ago and showed it to me, and I visited, and there it was. So take a little time and visit the site and see what you can learn from it. So these are the people that you will hear from today. The only one that you may not hear from today would be Mark Blevins. He usually does a showstopper plant for each of the plants, pests, and pathogens. And so he'd been out of town and got up with him late. So hopefully we will see plants from him the next time that we meet. And then you'll see Matt Bertone with entomology, and Mike Munster, who is today the guru of Audio Setup Wizard, and obviously wanting me to sing, and it's not going to happen. Okay, so moving on with this. So if you are not so familiar with Collaborate, and a lot of you are, this is just where things are located. So let's see if I can do this with my hand. If you look at this, let's see right here, what you've got right here is the toolbar. You may not ever use this, but that's something that is in existence for visiting the web or writing on the whiteboard over here, which usually the presentations are in, or looking at other documents. This is your area right here. So if you're speaking, please make sure you hit the talk button, because otherwise you'll just be talking to yourself. If you are wanting to, sometimes I've heard Mike ask the question if you can hear him, and give him a check. And so this is where you would click that check. If you have questions, you can raise your hand. It'll show up as a little red thing. If you are on, you will see not only your name down here, but you'll see your name up there. So don't think it's odd to see you in two places, because you will be there. The tools are here, so on the next slide you'll get to take advantage of the one that I've used right here with my hand, but you can do the star, whatever, we find out where you're from. And then this is the chat box, which some of you have already taken advantage of, but what I would like to do is to make sure that when you're doing a chat, it relates to what we're doing today. You can chat about other things another time, but this is where you would be able to put things that moderators can check out, and it may be where Barbara is answering questions for you today, just because of the speaking issue. Okay, so, and then this is the whiteboard where you will find all sorts of good information today. All right, so today our guest speaker is Barbara Fair, and so she's got a great presentation for you, which is all ready to go. And then they'll be doing a pre-test, and then current and upcoming insects with Matt Bertone, then a game. I'm excited to see what that will be. Current and upcoming diseases with Mike Munster, and then a post-test to find out exactly what you have learned today. And then finally, we've got a brief, hopefully brief, Extension Master Gardener Volunteer and Consumer Hort update. Some of the agents may be familiar with, but it hopefully is good information that you all can use. All right, so this is where you get to take advantage of your star or whatever picture you want to put. If you could do me a favor and click on your thing and show me where you're from. Well, great. Has everybody had a chance to enter something? Anybody from South Central? Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, so for the spring, which I know we're all looking forward to, this is a saucer magnolia, which was taken at Maymont up in Richmond probably last year, but the days are starting to get longer. Thank God. I don't like leaving in the dark. The fluctuation in temperature is still kind of going back and forth, but it should be overall moving towards warmer, although this winter was off and on kind of warm anyway. You should begin periodic checking of landscape plants for insect pests or diseases, and control summer annual weeds with mulch or pre-emergent herbicides as recommended in the Ag Chem Manual. All right, so today we have with us Dr. Barbara Fair. She's an associate professor downstairs in Kilgore in the Department of Horticultural Science. She is a landscape extension specialist and works with the county agents, urban and suburban communities, and the landscape industry. And so she's got an expertise in woody plant ID and selection, maintenance and planning, is also a certified arborist and a member of ISA. So Dr. Barbara Fair.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? A little maybe check or hands up or Lisa, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. I didn't want to sit here talking to myself because I do that enough as it is already. So hopefully we're good to go. I'm not so swift with this technology. I'm trying, but please bear with me. So we're going to talk about plants and cultural requirements today, and I'm sure a lot of you already know many things about that. But what I often still see is a lot of mistakes out there in how do I make this change? Oh, awesome. Okay, I'm getting the hang of it. So we're going to just kind of get right down to business here, and kind of the question is why should we care about making sure plants are sited essentially where they're supposed to be sited because of those cultural requirements? And can we all kind of get along? Can the plants get along together or not? And then just give you some ideas, some things to kind of think about and see when you're out and about in the landscape. So to ensure a healthy, long-lived landscape, to me, is our basic gist of why we want to do this. You can see kind of, and I laid this out a little bit for a PowerPoint, so I'm not, obviously there's going to be some issues with pictures, I can see from the beginning here. Anyway, so you're seeing like a lined street with beautiful elm trees, a little landscape with some very nice combinations of plants. And the one big thing is, can we put plants together that belong together? Because oftentimes I'll see landscapes, and I probably do it in my own yard, where we're putting plants together that have different cultural requirements. And if we apply irrigation, everybody gets the same amount of water. So we want to try to prevent that. And again, we're going for that long-lived landscape. And here's just a couple of other examples. This is a green roof in Salt Lake City. Very different climate than we have here, and we're doing a lot more green roofs. This is an intensive one. You can see large trees on this angle. And then the other picture is of Oregon, where I'll tell you what, they can grow some really great smoke trees. It's a green wall, and of course another little setting. Both of these are also in Portland, Oregon, and you can see kind of where that sidewalk is and the nice diversity of plants that kind of shields you from the buildings and creates this really cool little microclimate there, which, you know, is a place that people want to walk around and hang out. So why again are we talking about this? Because if we talk about this now, we can hopefully reduce the pests and pathogens that Mike and Matt are going to talk about later today. And certainly, hopefully, we can reduce plant stress if we can site plants where they belong. And of course, maintenance is a huge factor in this that I'm not going to talk about today because that could take us forever. Anyway, so everybody just get along, just, you know, kind of relax. Take a deep breath. We can work it all out. But As it turns out, maybe not all that much. And in some cases, that is kind of what we're stuck with. Certain creatures, certain plants, not going to work out so well together. And everybody seems to be into zombies these days. I can't really figure all that out, but who knows? So if any of you guys are interested in trees, or you're interested in turf, we know that these plants can really not grow well together. They do not thrive when they're grown together. Some cases the tree might do better than the turf, and in most cases the turf will do better than the trees, especially if you're irrigating. And we know that even though there are some turf species that don't require as much irrigation, some of the warm season grasses, you do often find that people irrigate those on a regular basis. When you're applying irrigation for turf, you're applying too much irrigation for the trees. And some turf grasses also have an allelopathic effect that can kill tree roots. So we want to really get people to stop doing this kind of practice. But, you know, we've been talking about it for a long, long time, especially as a tree person, and I often hear the thing you want to do is to get rid of the trees. I might not be in favor of that, as you might imagine. So we have this big area here that you could certainly put something else in there, even if it is mulch, rather than trying to grow turf up to the trunk of those trees. So the interesting thing is that plants, they kind of got it figured out for themselves. They know what they want, but we don't always pay attention to what they want or what they need. This is a red maple in a very small parking lot tree bed, and you can see it looks pretty stark there. It's pretty hot. This is a tree that's under stress, and how do I know that? Because you can see the top part is dead, and you can also see kind of on the right of that tree a little bit of early fall color. And of course the telltale sign is the sprouts at the base of the tree. Now for red maple, that's not unusual, but this amount is pretty typical sign of stress. So I'm really sorry you can't see all this, but what you get a close-up of here is a tree that is covered with gloomy scale, and I know that Matt could talk about this probably all day. And this is one of the reasons, though. The picture behind there is actually a red maple, and it was planted here on State's campus, and it, as you can see, it died. It was in a very small cutout, about 4 by 4, in a very large area with a lot of gray infrastructure. So it was a fairly hot place. And so I find that in the central, the Piedmont, and the eastern part of the state, it's really not a good idea to plant red maples in the tree lawn or along city streets. And why I say this is because they are typically a bottomland species. Their other common name besides red maple is actually swamp maple. So that means this tree likes to be moist, it likes to be cool, and being in the hot sun in a very small space, they're probably not going to do well. And so I'm kind of on my own personal mission to get folks to kind of slow down planting red maple. We know everybody loves them because they have a beautiful fall color. Well, you could try trident maple instead. There's other species that have great fall colors as well. So when we put a plant like this into that tough site, we know that we're making a mistake because that plant does not prefer that kind of a soil situation. And then sometimes we keep doing it. So here's an example of 3 Cornice, Florida, 3 flowering dogwoods, and you can see the small little spot that they're placed in, and you know that these trees are understory edge trees in the forests. So they like nice loamy soil, and they like to be cool in that kind of shady spot. But here's 3 trees that were planted, and you can see that they are declining. They were removed. Actually, 2 of the 3 were removed, the 2 that looked the most dead. However, they're putting dogwood back into that location, which is essentially just making the same mistake over again. It just might take a few years for them to recognize that was the worst spot to put them in. Then we, of course, have some plants that have special needs. We see a cuba, which grows great here, but if you put it into too much sun, then you end up with the black, crispy leaves. Pieris, on the other hand, really likes that moist, loamy, rich soil. It grows well in the mountains and fairly well in the Piedmont, but not really preferring those really hot spots. So what are the basic cultural requirements of plants? Well, number 1, soil. and what kind of soil, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. How many nutrients do they actually need? Do they need heavy feeding, or is it something that they just need a little bit of? Then we'll talk about climate and microclimate, and then moisture levels. How much water does the plant really need? So if you look at this pH, we all know about pH. So most of them do well between that 6 and 7, again, depending what they are. Now, if you're looking at something like blueberries and you want to use them in your yard as a food crop or a bird crop or a squirrel crop, you can put them, obviously, in your yard as long as you have pHs fairly low, down around that 4 to 5. So you really have to know what that plant prefers. And then, of course, you know, as all of us extension people always talk about, you have to do a soil test in order to determine what that pH is. Because if you put, say, blueberries in and the pH is up near 6, then you're probably not going to get a very healthy blueberry plant. pH, again, very species specific. So we want to know what's going on, what the pH is, because it'll determine what nutrients are available. So for example, if you were wanting to grow red maple in a not hot spot, if you want to grow that red maple there, we want to make sure that pH is in that lower range, like 5.5 to 6.5. If you're up in that higher range, you will certainly see chlorosis, and that's because of a manganese deficiency with that higher pH. Then many oaks, like pin oak, prefer a low pH as well, but when that pH is higher, it's an iron deficiency in that case. So you really have to think about, all right, what plant is it, what's its nutrient requirement, and how does pH affect that? And certainly because it's in the soil, it affects all kinds of other activity in the soil as well. And so obviously if you're affecting aluminum and other metals, then you can have serious issues with toxic levels at very low pHs. This gives you a really good idea. There's that 6.5, kind of 6 to 7. You can see why that area, why that's a perfect pH, and because it all goes all the way down, and so you have a great amount of the concentration of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, as well as sulfur. And then the other micronutrients that you need are available in those lower levels because they aren't needed, obviously, in such high concentrations. So just an example of some plants that prefer acidic soils. You've got hollies, of course, blueberries, sweet bay magnolia. And sweet bay magnolia is another great plant for rain garden sites, great plant for the patio, of course azaleas and rhododendrons, and then ferns. And remember, a lot of people are really kind of getting into ferns. They add a really cool texture to the shade garden. Soil pH, again, alkaline soils in this case, vinca, and I know for those of you that prefer native species, vinca is not on your list. Vinca does do very well in most situations, no matter what the pH. Paperbark maple, another great plant. I think it may be a bit too hot in some of our locations here for that. It is a very slow grower. Of course, forsythia, American smoke tree. And I don't see this on the market a whole lot, but there is one called Grace out there that is a hybrid between this and I'm sorry, I'm having a brain fart, Cotinus grigii. And then lavender cotton is just like an example of an herb type plant that you could use in the landscape. So soil test is true. In this case, you'll see this cherry on the left, and that is a deficiency of phosphorus, which is fairly significant. And then on the right is a palm, and they need a lot of manganese. I'm sorry, potassium in this case. So there's a lot of different things that can affect the health of these plants and how they look, and the pattern of how that nutrient availability is found in the plant itself. So there has been a lot of talk lately about making some fertilizers that only have N and K in them. And I know Scott's and a couple of the other large companies have been doing that, although in some cases you still need to have phosphorus added. And so you have to, again, that soil test is pretty important with finding out what you've got. So I'm sure none of you have ever seen anything like this, where the people come in, of course, and build a development. Here's a development that was on the left that's a little bit older, and then the development on the right that's fairly new, and they've got the grass and turf in there, but they're just starting to put trees in. And so this kind of activity, this soil compaction, is what ends up causing serious issues with plant performance in the landscape. Because as we know, they'll come back, they'll put a little bit of topsoil back on top, but they don't till up the soil beneath, they don't break up that that hard pan. So soil structure is really important to understand, and the best way to affect this is just try to put a probe in the ground. And I recommend doing it when the soil's kind of moist, because if it's compacted and it's dry, it really is hard to get the probe into the ground. So that kind of tells you right there what you might be dealing with. And so soil structure essentially alters the growth of the roots in that system. Now, a lot of people say it's because it has a lower oxygen concentration, which actually isn't quite true. It is the fact that because those pores are so disconnected from one another due to the compaction, that oxygen is not readily moved back and forth through that soil matrix. So you'll also see obviously a reduction in how much biomass, how much yield you might have if you're looking more at like a crop plant like blueberries or strawberries or whatever. And again, species vary even down to the cultivar level and how they respond to soil compaction. The big thing again is that it can lead to stress in the plant, and then that can lead to other serious issues. So when you're looking at how you put a plant and what kind of space does it need, there are certainly some plants that can handle a much smaller space in the ground. Obviously, we have to know what the size of the tree is going to be or the plant is going to be before we place it. And that's true whether you're putting plants along a street and have to worry about above ground utilities, or you're planting them close to your house, or kind of limiting their space in the landscape. And so that's really important because plants do compete with each other. So you want to make sure that the soil is nice and friable, or it has good tilth. And the only way that might happen in many of our urban developments is to go in and actually till that ground and add some organic matter to the soil. Oftentimes, too, I used to work for a landscape crew, and we used to plant in these terrible development soils, and it was like a time machine down there. You could find a lot of strange things underground. So again, we didn't really take into consideration the limitations of this plant, how big they're going to get, or how small they would actually be if we only give them a very small size. So I love plants, I love trees even more, but there's certainly places where we should not be putting trees in the landscape. So when you talk about climate and microclimate, we'll talk about a few of these things, and I'm not going to pause there. So here's a very interesting microclimate, very shady, obviously very cool, much cooler than it would be if you are kind of out on the left-hand side of that picture. But what you can't see here, or very well, is they're trying to grow turf, and you can see a little bit of it over here on the right. But again, not taking into consideration that most, if not all, turf species do need quite a bit of sunlight, particularly the warm season grasses. We're in that transition zone too with turf, where you've got cool season grasses and warm season grasses, and the line sort of runs a little bit diagonally from west up to the northeastern corner of the state. Re-reflected heat. So this is one of the reasons we love to have plants material downtown, especially trees, because it can help cool things, and because the heat down there is much higher. And I'll show you just in a second the urban heat island, which many of you have probably heard of. But that re-reflected heat increases the temperature, decreases humidity, and obviously increases water stress. Again, not maybe a site for a bottomland species. Here's that urban heat island effect, and you can kind of see what happens during the day. You get a lot of fluctuations, but it's a lot higher above where that certain tight urban area is with all that gray infrastructure, and you can see kind of how that temperature goes at night as well. So we need plants downtown, especially because of this urban heat island, but we need them to be tolerant of those conditions before we put them out there. So here's a nice little example. This is a row of trees along a highway, and the trees that are circled are actually ginkgo. And although ginkgo grows really slow, it is a great urban tree. It's really tough. It's tolerant of air pollution and all kinds of issues, compacted soil, and obviously heat and re-reflected heat. And you can see the other trees along here are already kind of declining. They're brownish. They're not going to probably make it for much longer. So of course, and again, small space. So of course I would recommend putting in some more ginkgo there. So we talk about the cold hardiness zones. You can see kind of what our cold hardiness zones are here in North Carolina. They are changing a bit. where we have much of Zone 8 in the southeastern part of our state. But also another thing to take into consideration, and this is a map that they've recently added to the USDA ag websites, and this looks at the average number of days above 86 degrees. And you can see for North Carolina, they're pretty significant temperature days that have a lot of high temperatures. Now, one of the things that we've talked about with predictions from climate change is that what they believe is going to happen here in the southeastern part of the United States is we will continue to have very hot summers with limited rainfall, and we will have very, very wet falls. And so with that pattern forming, you can see that we have to have plants that can adapt to both of those conditions. Now, does that mean we can bring more southern species up, more Zone 8 species into North Carolina? Probably. Zone 9 plants? Maybe, maybe not. But keep in mind, too, that as you bring plants up south, you might also be bringing the pest species with them, or you may have pest species here that aren't really pests, but might become more of a pest in the heat, or might become less of a pest. So I'm going to leave that up to those entomology guys. So here's another little example of kind of a microclimate and having plants work together. I see a lot of this. This is what I call the underwear of the landscape. That's what mulch is. You know, some folks wear it, some folks don't. We don't really need to talk about that, but we shouldn't see so much mulch. We should see plants underneath there. And so picking the right plants for a site like that. Keeping in mind there will be competition with the tree. Certainly you can mulch with that, but I hate seeing those giant seas of mulch. It does minimize weeds, but it is also very uninteresting in the landscape. Couple other just options too. You can see these are obviously going to be also between the two of these very different climates, little microclimates, where we have the typical foundation plantings, and here, and this is in my neighborhood, where you see a lot of turf. It's fairly low impact, so you could consider it fairly sustainable landscape because they don't really do much of anything to it except maybe mow the grass. This one on the right, a little bit more intensive, and this is right north of NC State's campus. They like pink a lot. Light levels. And we always kind of challenge with this because you'll have on a tag, it'll say full sun or it'll say partial sun or partial shade, which are the two trickiest ones. And essentially the partial shade is a plant that can, they'll use them interchangeably depending. So if a plant will really do much better at that upper end, like the 5 or 6 hours of sun, then you want to call that partial sun. If that plant will do better at the lower end, like 3 or 4 hours, then that's better. And keep in mind, it also depends on where's the light coming from, how intense is that light, is in the eastern or northern, western, whatever, exposure. Those are all really important to think about when looking at, all right, is this their light requirement, but also is how hot is it going to be in those locations, okay? So shade, of course, is anything under 2 hours of light, and obviously there's plenty of plants that can do that, and you have like kind of that dappled shade effect too. So we want to really think about where we're putting our plants. So I don't know if any of you guys are probably not old enough to know the song Dust in the Wind by, I think it's either Kansas or Boston, but I always kind of like to add a little bit of fun to it. I won't try to sing it for you. I'll leave the singing up to Lisa. But so how does the wind blow where your site is? Is it coastal? Is it inland? Does it have salt in it? Because certainly that salt is going to affect plants way into that, not just right at the coast, but I don't know, you guys that live at the coast know this probably better than me, that it's going to be far into that kind of interior part. So, or do you have a mountain? Because if you're living on top of the mountain, it's often going to be fairly windy. So you want to think about what kinds of winds those are. Many evergreen plants, if it's dry in the winter, then you might have issues. So I just pulled a couple of plants for windy sites up, heather, sea holly, and hardy geranium, and all of these are actually all of these are salt tolerant except the hardy geranium. So just some cool plants that you might be able to try in those sites. Here's a few others. These are perennials, Delosperma. And again, Delosperma likes things really, really well dried, as do most dianthus. So knowing that those plants like that really dry site, you could put them in kind of a scree garden. You can use them in hypertufas, a lot of different cool places. Jupiter's beard's another one. I've had that. That's kind of a moderate plant. You can go in a couple of different locations. Calendula and Crocosmia. I myself cannot seem to grow Crocosmia at all, but Calendula is a great annual plant, especially if you guys are interested in pollinators. These plants are pretty tough. Again, they like that well-drained, moist soil, but they are salt tolerant. So how much water does a plant need exactly? Well, you know, we talk about this xeriscaping, and there's a lot of xeriscaping done out west. And most people, when they think of xeriscaping, they think of desert-type plants. And we can do xeriscaping here based on plants' water needs, where we group them essentially due to how much water do they want? Do they want a little? Do they want a lot? But before we kind of go into that, I just want to talk just real quickly about roots, so we understand where those roots are, so we can think about how do we have to water those plants, and how much of that soil is really going to affect what's happening with that plant and its ability to uptake water. We know if the soil is compacted, it's not going to do. It's going to be hard for plants to pull water out of that system, because their roots can't extend very far. And then remember, all those pores are disconnected, so it's a very tortuous route from water or oxygen to move from one root to the next kind of throughout that whole soil system. So roots do a lot, and when you talk about most trees here in the kind of eastern half of the United States, you'll see that their roots, if left unfettered, that there's no hardscape somewhere in the way, can actually grow out 2 to 3 times that drip line or that crown there. And the drip line area we also call the critical root zone, because in this area right here we don't want to do any kind of activity that might compact the soil or cut the roots. Now you can certainly cut some, it just depends on how close you are, and that's the talk for a different time as well. But so keeping in mind, I have to tell you a quick little story. I drive to yoga every day here in Raleigh, and I passed a big beautiful house in Boland Heights, and I saw a guy out front. They had 2 gorgeous big willow oak, and he was tilling underneath one of these willow oaks, and then of course he put in a new sidewalk for the site. He did plant some plants underneath there, but I'm not sure how long that tree will be standing in the future. It'll take a long time for it to die though, because it's fairly large, and we won't remember, oh yeah, that's right, we did kind of till up all those roots. So we want to protect those roots, keep those areas cool if we can, especially here in the South. An example of some really great drought-tolerant plants. Some barberries are considered invasive, so you may not want to use those. But golden rain tree, I think we could use a lot more of the golden rain tree, and this is Colereteria paniculata. There is its cousin, which is also considered somewhat invasive. But anyway, so thinking about drought tolerance. Drought tolerance only comes once that plant is established. So most people will say, well, native plants are more drought tolerant than non-native plants. And we know already that's not really true, because we have red maple that really does prefer moister soil and is not necessarily drought tolerant. Here's a prime example of what I'm talking about. This is at, I think this was in Pittsburgh, or Greenville. I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head, but these are both red maples. I took the one on the left, I took that picture, I turned around and took the picture of the one on the right. Both red maples, both in the same kind of location. There may be some slight differences in the soil, but the actual primary difference here is the tree on the left is irrigated. And the one on the right is not irrigated, but it's also growing in competition with turf. And you can see the turf is not doing so well either. So here's a couple things tolerant of wet soils. If you've never tried buttonbush, you really ought to try it. It'll grow in drier soils as well, but if you're looking at the edge of a pond or maybe the edge of a wetland, that would certainly be a plant that could go well in there. Bald cypress, obviously, and winterberry is another really awesome plant for those wetter areas. And obviously, remember, you need to have the males and the females in this case, but you need only one male to pollinate a number of females. So what actually happens if we don't think about the culture of the plant? So you have things that will start showing up. And as I said, oftentimes if it's a much older plant, it'll take time for those symptoms become noticeable. And by then it's probably too late. And oftentimes we forget that we didn't exactly put that plant in the right site based on what it needs. So you'll see, you know, obviously in any drought situation you could get these scorched leaves, and this is Cornus Florida, again, a flowering dogwood that has those brown edges, and that's due to scorch. There are some diseases that can cause leaf scorch, but and so there may be a question there, but in most cases you're probably looking at leaf scorch because it was probably in too much sun or it was too dry. And so on. So you'll often find early leaf drop and fall color. You'll get branch dieback eventually as it gets sprouting along large trunks, suckering at the base. So if you just think back to that one picture I showed you of that red maple in the parking lot, you'll see that that plant had all of those signs. And it probably had them for a long time, but obviously not a very well-maintained landscape. And so then you might find evidence of borers, exit holes, and so on, or some kind of disease pathogens. When bark starts splitting and it's not a tree that's supposed to have bark sloughing off, like the paper bark maple or river birch, then you know something might not be quite right. And then if you're looking at turf, you know, you want to see what kind of bare patches you might have or other issues. So I hope I did that fast enough, but I just want you to think about kind of reminding your clients what we need to think about when we talk about plants. We know that the plant knows what it needs. Oftentimes we don't pay attention to that, and that's when our plants don't succeed, don't thrive, and will not live as long as they potentially could otherwise. I've heard many times people talking about urban trees, and they say the average urban tree only lives 7 years. And I don't really believe that. I'm a little bit skeptical about that because I've seen many urban trees live a very long time. But maybe they're the odd men out, so to speak. So when we think about planning a sustainable landscape for the long term, there are so many plants out there, so many opportunities to pick a plant that's going to work in that particular site. And if it's not, is there a way you can do some manipulation of the site in order to allow that species to be planted? For example, if it's too wet, can you drain that site? Can you create a raised bed? So those are things that you have to decide with once you're doing a site assessment. What does this site have to offer? You can't change pH for a long period of time. You can change it in the short term, but it's something that you will continuously have to monitor and probably add some sort of amendment to either keep the pH low or bring the pH up a little bit. Because we know most turf grasses are in that 6.5 to 7 or a little bit above 7, whereas once you get down below 6.5, you're in trouble, although centipede grass does pretty well at those lower pHs. So you always want to think about the long term, and I think we're not always very good at that. You know, we want the biggest trees, the biggest pots, the biggest thing we can get to put in that landscape for an immediate effect. And oftentimes I see, at least I see that, and you guys probably see it too, where you're seeing plants that do not thrive in those landscapes because either it was not the right plant for the site was not prepped properly, the plant was not planted properly, nor was it established well. So it is kind of a suite of issues that often affect a particular plant's performance in the landscape, but thinking about the cultural requirements is the first and best way to get a good, healthy start. So I'm happy to take questions if I have time.
Okay, Barbara, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can, Lisa.
Oh, yay! Okay. So people can ask questions. They can either put them in the chat box, or they can just ask them if they have a microphone. Just make sure that after you ask your question, you turn your microphone off. Thanks. Okay. Well, I don't see any questions, but if there are any questions that pop up later, Barbara, you're of course welcome to stay for this entire thing if you'd like, because it'll be really valuable. But the other side of it is, if you don't and the other questions come up, I'll get with you and see how we can forward those to you. But thank you very much for this really excellent talk, and I appreciate your time and coming today.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate the invitation, and I do want to give a shout out to Matt for the really cool stuff. I heard him talking on NPR, and it's a really exciting project that he's working on, so I just wanted to give him a shout out and congratulate him. Thanks a lot for your time, and you guys have a great week.
Hey, thanks, Barbara. I'm actually about to talk about a little bit about that in a minute. So.
Okay, Judy and Nell, do you have questions? I see your hands are raised. Chris, do you have a question?
Yes. Is Barbara still there? I had a question about crepe myrtle. I had this huge crepe myrtle tree in my yard, and it's kind of like near the edge of where the turf is. I guess my question is, you know, I do have some mulch around it, probably about maybe about 2 feet around it. Is that, I mean, the tree I've had for about 7-8 years, and it seems to be doing really well there. Do I need to do I need to get the turf further away from the base of the tree? I guess that's what I was asking.
Yeah, Chris, that's a great question. You know, as a tree person, I like as much mulch around the base of that tree, and I don't mean thickness, I mean diameter that we can potentially get. But for a crepe myrtle, 2 feet, that's perfectly sufficient. The plant should do fine, and if it's already doing fine for you, then great. And that's kind of one of the things that makes what we do so much harder than rocket science, I think. You know, everybody thinks they can plant trees and plant plants and take care of them, and we all know it's actually a lot more complicated than that. And so if you have something that works for you and it's been working for you, then go for it. Keep going at it. But if it's something that, you know, maybe it's not doing so well, the plant looks a little bit lethargic, you know, then that may mean, of course, you might need to do a soil test and see what the fertility is like. And certainly, is there something else that we can do to improve the growth of that plant? So that's a terrific question. So if you're doing something that's working, you keep doing it.
Okay, thank you. It's looking good. I tell you one thing about these crepe myrtle trees. I started raising bees about 2 years ago, and I think when I first got my bees, every single bee was in that tree on those flowers. So the bees love that crepe myrtle. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn this over to Matt and Mike, and I will talk to you at the end. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Let's see where we're going. Okay. Welcome to our session. I'll be going first, and we'll introduce Mike in a little bit. And,
that's me.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, but first, before we start, let's do a little pretest. Okay.
Take out a piece of paper and pencil and number from 1 to 5.
Yep, and we'll give you a few seconds, 15 to 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds for each question. Okay, first question. Match each domestic beetle larva to the adult. We'll give you about 25 seconds. It's going to be a fun one. Okay, next question. Which of these is the drugstore beetle? Stegobium paniceum. Okay, that's about 30 seconds. Let's see. Question 3. What tree is this? Okay. Number 4. Which rose disease is only serious in the nursery, at least in North Carolina? It's a tough one. Maybe it's just because I'm an entomologist.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's no tougher than the one about the drugstore beetle.
That was easy. Okay, give you a few more seconds on this one. Okay, and finally, true or false, boxwood blight continues to be a problem in North Carolina. I'll give you only about 15 seconds for that one. You got a 50-50 shot at that one. Alrighty. Well, there's your pretest, and hopefully you had enough time to answer these questions. We'll come back to that and answer the questions in a little bit. But first, let's talk about your homes. So Barbara mentioned that some of our research, my research, has been in the news lately. If you haven't heard anything about that, I'm going to talk a little bit about that, especially since it's still a little cold out. We're not seeing much growth in the plants outdoors, and you know, this is an opportune time to talk about things in homes because agents and people often get questions about things that are in homes. So our paper just came out recently, our Arthropods of the Great Indoors paper, and basically a group of us in Raleigh sampled 50 homes within 30 miles of the Raleigh Center, and for arthropods, we collected every arthropod we could find in every room that was in the house, and we collected over 10,000 specimens and estimated at least 579 species in there. Now, the average home had about 93 species. Most of these species were accidental insects and arthropods that came in from the outdoors and ended up dying in the doors. But there are many groups that persist in homes and can live their lives out in homes and reproduce. And I'd like to cover some of those groups today because you may get questions about these things. People worried about bed bugs these days and cockroaches and other pests. And many of the things we did collect were not pests. So I'd like to highlight some things that people might be finding in homes and may be worried about, but hopefully this will help alleviate some of those worries. Okay, so we found 12 groups in over 80% of homes. In descending order, we found cobweb spiders, carpet beetles, gall midges, ants, book lice, darkwing fungus gnats, cellar spiders, weevils, mosquitoes, scuttleflies, the 40, leaf hoppers, and non-biting midges. Now I bolded the ones that are known to live out their lives indoors. Ants typically only come indoors for water and food, although some, like carpenter ants, may live in the actual structure of the house. Weevils, there's many that come in accidentally, but there are also things like this grain weevil here that can be a pest, and I'll be mentioning them a little bit more later. And scuttleflies, some of them breed in homes, some of them just fly into homes. We've sent off our specimens to a scuttlefly expert who's actually looking for new species. It'll be really great to get a new species collected from a home. So this is what we're looking at, and so I'm going to cover some of these groups, and one additional group that's not on here but is very common in homes. Actually was found in 76% of homes, so very close. Okay, and now one of the graphics in the paper that I really enjoy is we basically, if we took an average diversity of the average room, so some rooms were 100% spiders, some rooms were 50% flies and 50% bugs, but if you average that diversity up across all the over 550 rooms that we sampled, you get this kind of diversity of morphospecies. So the most common groups and the most diverse groups are going to be flies, spiders, beetles, and wasps, mostly ants. And then descending down to book lice, bugs, cockroaches, springtails, and such. So the average room, if you take a big room, this might be a typical average, but this is going from basement all the way up to attic, different bedrooms, kitchens, things like that. So these are going to be the most common things you're going to find, basically. So the first group, the Therididi, these are the cobweb spiders. A very common group. They were actually found in 65% of the rooms we sampled. These are small to medium globular spiders. They're much more at home, all those ones running, they're much more at home in a web. And you often see a couple of different genera on and around your house and in your house. They do, like I said, have large round abdomens. Also under microscopic view, you can see the hind tarsus, so this part of the hind leg actually has this large comb-like structure, this large setae that are used to make the web, fray the web and manipulate the web when it's the silk coming out of the spinnerets. The ones around homes, although the family has the highest diversity of web types of all spiders, the ones around homes typically create these very, very disorganized three-dimensional webs, usually with strands down to the ground. And they'll sit in the center. The strands down to the ground are actually key to many of these because they're under tension, and when an ant or some kind of crawling insect hits that, it'll break it, and then it'll kind of get stuck up in the web. And this is how they hunt. And I actually have some really great photos of some very large insects like dragonflies and big moths being trapped by these spiders, which then can delicately go down and feed on them. Now, most of these are harmless. There have been known to be some small, slight adverse reactions to getting bit by these, but they typically don't bite and they're not aggressive at all. The only exception to these are the widow spiders, which are a type of cobweb spider, Latrodectus species, and of course people know that they can be dangerous and pretty much know how to identify them. But for the most part, we found Steatoda, species of Steatoda, and most commonly Parasteatoda tepidariorum, which is called the common house spider. You often see these outside on your home. Now the next group of spiders, the Fulcidae, the cellar spiders. These are very long, thin-legged spiders, very fragile-looking spiders. Again, these are very harmless. They actually even tested them on Mythbusters to see if they were really venomous but couldn't pierce our skin. Well, we know they're not very venomous. They also have fangs that are much too small to pierce our skin. So they're just a spider that's there. You don't have to worry about them biting or being aggressive. Now, they feed on insects, but also other spiders, and they're actually known to climb into the webs of other spiders and eat them. So they are actually kind of a control for other spiders, but of course they are a spider themselves. So if you're an arachnophobe, I don't think that really helps. They often sit in a disorganized web like cobweb spiders, and they may shake when disturbed. So if you go up to a big specimen, it may start to shake its web violently, and I think that's to make it look bigger and more scary, even though we know it's not really harmful, and it's kind of this act to make it look bigger. They're often found in the lower levels and in basements, in crawl spaces, and many of them, when the females produce eggs, they actually carry this bundle of eggs in their chelicerae. Now, the two main species, or two main groups, are Fulcus species. There are a few species, but mostly Fulcus phalangioides is the main one we have. They're more elongate. And then Spermophorus sinoculata is a very small, roundish one that's often found in the upper levels of the home rather than the basements. So you often see these up on ceilings and in corners, places like that. And again, they're harmless. Now, just to get a nice, scary face-looking thing, but this is actually the face of a Fulcus of a male, and it's got these very large palps that are used for mating, as all spiders do. Basically, some people think they're brown recluses when they find them because they've got this dark marking on their head, on their carapace. But they differ from brown recluses in many ways. First of all, they have many long spines on their legs. They also have these eyes in these groups. So Fulcus have two groups of 3 and then a pair in the middle. Spermophora actually only have 6 eyes, where they lack this central pair. Brown recluses, on the other hand, will have a pair here, a pair in the middle, and then a pair on this side too. So very different. And of course, brown recluses will not be in webs and are almost, basically almost never found in North Carolina. You can find a few of them, but they're around in various places. But you're rarely, if ever, you're probably never going to see one in your entire life if you live in North Carolina. Okay, so another group that most people don't know about maybe, but are very common in homes, are the Liposolididae, the book lice. These are true lice in the order Socodia. They are very small, about 1 millimeter long. You can see here is one on a grain of rice. So again, very tiny insects. Some of them, sometimes they can be associated with stored products, but often they're just around the house feeding on other things. Many are associated with bird or mammal nests, and I guess our homes are kind of like a mammal nest because we're mammals. So they're pretty well at home there. And they're related to parasitic lice, but they are not parasitic. They don't suck blood, they don't feed on blood, or they don't feed on skin or anything like that. They will feed on hair, but only the hair we shed on the floor or so. So they'll be cleaning up that stuff. They feed on bits of organic matter, hair, dead insects, but can invade stored products. They're also common in moldy and mildewy areas. They call them book lice because old books get very mildewy, and they'll be feeding on scraping the spores and the mildew from there. Basically, they've got little tiny kind of forks in their mouth that they use to scrape up little bits of organic matter, or feed on dead insects and hairs and feathers and things like that. And they're common all around the home. They're very easy to identify because they've got this bulging face, and they're very flat. And the family itself, the Liposolididae, are characterized by these very large hind legs. They've got very big thighs almost. Now, when I was in San Francisco doing a little studying, and these groups are found here, there's some other book lice, in quotes. These are not in the family Liposolididae, but you can see they're very similar with this bulging face. I think this reticulated winged trogeid is really cute and pretty adorable, and its wings are just these little tiny flaps. So it cannot fly. They just crawl around on floors and eat little bits. You can see, to a book louse, your floor looks like, you know, a buffet. So So basically, these are very common insects in homes. If you put out sticky traps to monitor for other pests, you're often going to get these on there. They're often on windowsills or the baseboards of floors and such. Okay, dark-winged fungus gnats, Sciarity, are another very common one. Most people are very familiar with these. If you work outside, they're very common outside around rotting logs and compost bins. But in homes, they're most often associated with overwatered houseplants. They're one of the most common flies in homes. They're very small, about 1 to 2 millimeters, maybe a little bit bigger than that, but typically not. And they're dark flies with usually smoky or very dark wings. These are a little lighter, these ones, than some of the ones you might find in homes that are almost all black. But this tuning fork, it's a little easier to see in this photo. In the middle of the wing, they have a little tuning fork-like vein. And that's the best way to identify them. They also have an eye bridge, where if you look under a microscope, their eyes connect in a thin little strip on the top of their head. The larvae are white and worm-like with a black head, and they can be found in potting soil, like I said. They do not bite, so if you see them flying around, they're more of a nuisance. They're really not going to hurt anybody, and it could be a sign that you're watering your house plants too much. Okay. Now, Collembola were not on the list. Like I said, they were in 76% of homes, at least the one common group, the elongate ones. But these are springtails, and they are very small arthropods. The waffles between whether they're true insects or not. We kind of call them non-insect hexapods now because they've got 6 legs. But these are very small, about 1 millimeter long. Mostly we found Entomobridae. These are elongate springtails. Sometimes we found globular species, and I'll show you a few of them in a second. Now these are often hairy or scaly. You can see all these hairs on this one. And they have a long forked process held under the body. It looks like a double tail. You can actually kind of see it right here, the tips of it. They hold it under the body, and then when they want to go to jump, they release it, and it springs them up in the air. And that's what launches them, and that gives them the name springtail. They're usually found near moisture or molds and algae. So this is actually outside on my old deck. This is algae-covered wood. But I saw one just yesterday in my bathroom on a windowsill. They're often found also under the plant pots and doors, between the pot and the saucer. The little organic debris and things like that build up are really nice. And the plants also get the moisture, which helps keep the springtails happy. They are not harmful. They do not bite. They can be found in high numbers in bathrooms, but that's typically because there's a moisture issue or they're just looking for moisture. And in the study, in fact, there was one bathtub I remember that I found hundreds of springtails just dead in the bathtub. Now, they do feed on rotting materials, typically fungus, algae, and leaf litter, things like that. So they can be also very common in compost bins. Now, I mentioned the globular ones. These are a very different group of springtails. They don't have they don't have segmentation in their abdomen. They're more like a ball. This is a dicertomid springtail, globular springtail. And another relative of the Entomobridae are the Tomoceridae, which are sometimes found in homes, but definitely not as frequently as Entomobrides. They differ from Entomobrides. If we can go back, Entomobrides have fairly even antennal segments, whereas Tomocerids have a very long third antennal segment, and then at the tip there's going to be a very tiny fourth antennal segment. You can also see the Tomocerids are often covered in scales. Some of them are very beautiful iridescent scales, like a butterfly almost. But again, these things are only a few millimeters long typically. Okay, now Dermestidea. This will help answer your first pretest question. So carpet beetles, they're very common in homes. And several genera are found in homes, although Anthrenus is the most common. Oftentimes I'll get people that come in and they have these in a bag and they say, oh, I think I've got bed bugs, but it's actually the larvae of carpet beetles, which do not bite. They are harmless in that regard. The adults are hairy typically or covered in scales. These patterns right here are actually very small scales that make up the body clothing, basically, and they're often in patterns. Now, the larvae are also very often covered in hairs or specialized hairs, too, that help protect them from predators. I actually, when I was on set, we're doing some filming related to this a while ago with National Geographic. We had a spitting spider that we wanted to feed, one of these carver beetles, but as soon as the spitting spider went up to try and eat it, and it spit on it, it tried to eat it, it got its mouth full of these hairs. And you could see it was visibly mad and irritated that it got all these this mouthful of hairs. So they're very well protected by that. The larvae feed on hair, wool, feathers, dead insects, and stored products. But typically in a home, yeah, they're going to be feeding on shed hairs, dead insects. I saw them around bird cages because of the shed feathers. They like keratin-based animal products. They don't eat cotton. They don't eat synthetic carpets. And the reason they're called carpet beetles is because previously when we had wool carpets, that was a common food source for these beetles. So that's kind of the olden days name. I don't know if we should change it, but I think it's a good name. The adults are often found on windowsills. The adults, they're not softened, but they're often found on windowsills because once they emerge as an adult, they want to get outside. They like to be on flowers and feed on pollen. And then once they've fed on pollen and are satisfied, they can go to a nest or a bird nest and or home and try and lay their eggs. That said, they can be pests of wool rugs or garments because they do feed on those things. Okay, so just to answer your pretest question, so here are the three main genera. Anthrenus is definitely the most common, then Trogoderma, then Adagenus, as far as the types of dermestids. Anthrenus are small and usually back-heavy. They usually have large tufts of setae on their rump, and their adults are very round and scaly. Anthrenus verbacea right here is a very common European species. It's all over the world now, and it has these yellow and beige or gray and black markings on it. That's the most common one that we find in homes, but also we find the genus Trogoderma, which has similar larvae to the Anthrenus, except they're more elongate. Their rumps don't have a very heavy setae. It's mostly very similar to the preceding segments, and they're typically a little bit larger. Trogoderma adults are, instead of covered with flat setae, are covered with little hairs that also make patterns, but typically less bold. The last one is Adagenus. I love their larvae the most because they're just crazy looking. Basically, they've got, they're long and tapered. They typically, if you look very closely, they're going to have very small thorn-like scales all over their body rather than just hairs. And they also have this kind of rat tail tuft of hairs coming off the end of the abdomen. The adults are more hairy than scaly, but they're really not very patterned. This one actually looks like on a wool rug at the time. And that actually was during the study. We took a photo of that. So basically, and all of these are very small. They're only a few millimeters long. This one you can see is on the grout in between bathroom tiles, so very, very tiny. But they are common in homes. Okay, now moving on. So those are some of the common things we found in homes, and you should be aware of if you're getting questions about these things, especially the agents, but also master gardeners. If you might have a neighbor that's concerned about those, they might think might know that you know a little bit about insects. But here are more of the pestiferous ones that live in the homes, not as far as biting. I'm not going to cover any bed bugs or any biting things, but pantry pests, things that are feeding on the things we like to eat. So typically these are going to be beetles and moths, but a few other groups will affect pantry foods like mites, book lice, like I mentioned, and a few others. Now they inhabit and feed on the dried products. And you can see here these two dog biscuits, these two dog treats have all these little bore holes in it from a beetle. And this is actually a canister of nuts that has been infested with moths, and you can see all the moths flying around in there. So today I'm just going to be covering the non-meat or cheese products. Now meats and cheeses actually have a different suite They have insects that are more preferring protein-rich or the cheese with lots of fats and things like that. These are going to be more dried products like carbohydrate-rich or even nuts and dried fruits and things like that. Okay, so the Anabiidae, the death watch beetles, are one of the more common groups because there's two main species that are in that group that affect pantry stores. That is the drugstore beetle and the cigarette beetle. That is a misspelling right there. The larvae are C-shaped grubs, kind of like little tiny white grubs, but they're very small. Both of these beetles are only about 2 or 3 millimeters long, basically. They infest many products, from typical store products to herbarium specimens, spices, books, pills, and glue, among many others. They have a broad, thanks for the spelling, they have a broad palate, basically, and apparently they have yeast to allow them to digest various foods. Both species acquire their yeast from their parents. When they lay the eggs, they feed on the egg to emerge, and they get these yeasts to help them. Now, which one is which? This is a very common question, and so here's the difference. So the drugstore beetle, so this is the answer to your question. The drugstore beetle has its antennae with the last 3 segments enlarged, whereas the cigarette beetle has long antennae that are saw-like with all the segments about the same size. The drugstore beetle also has pits, lines of pits in their elytra, whereas it's difficult to see here, but the cigarette beetle lacks these pits. The elytra is smooth under that short fur that it has there. And lastly, it's a little bit, you got to kind of compare them or see them a lot, but I see no sound now. Is that just specific to Hampstead Annex? Do people hear me?
We can still hear you.
Okay, great. Basically, the drugstore beetle is a little bit more pill-shaped and elongate, whereas the cigarette beetle can actually tighten up into almost a ball, but is a little less elongate. Okay, Sylvanidae. These are the flat bark beetles, which many of them live out in nature under the bark of dead trees and logs, feeding on fungus. But a couple of species have become very important stored product pests. These are the sawtooth grain beetle, Oryzophilus surinamensis, and the merchant grain beetle, Oryzophilus mercator. They infest many dried products. I actually have 2 colonies here at my desk, one on some mixed nuts, which are doing pretty well. They're producing larvae and everything, and another on some rye seeds that they came in on. They're fairly fast and flat. They have these clubbed antennae. They're gradually clubbed and a symmetrical club. And they also have a toothed prothorax. The edges of the prothorax have teeth, and they have these 3 ridges. So they're fairly easy to identify by that. Now, the larvae also feed on the products and look like just little white kind of mealworms almost, but they're a little difficult. But you're going to see the adults. If you see the larvae, you're going to see the adults, and they're much more easy to identify. Now, between those 2 species, the temple, which is basically behind the eye, the part behind the eye, is the diagnostic character. So in mercator, it's thin. It's about half the width of the eye, whereas in surinamensis, the sawtooth grain beetle, the temple is more than half of the width of the eye. So, based on that, can anybody tell me which species this is? You can type it in, or turn on your mic and say it, or type it might be good. Anybody? Sawtooth? No, sorry. That's actually mercator. You can see how tiny the temple is. It's actually less than half the width of the eye. Very tiny, point-like one rather than a big, thick one. It's a little difficult to see. If you're seeing them up close, you might have a better chance, but basically they both do about the same thing anyway, so really there's no need to know the species exactly. all the time. But anyway, it's just an exercise to see that. So these are a very common group that are infesting stored products. Okay, the next one, there's one species of Bostrichidae, which are the powder post beetles, the horned powder post beetles. Typically, horned powder post beetles are fairly large insects, 5 millimeters to, almost an inch long. Some of them even larger, some of the palm borers. But the lesser grain borer, Rhizopertha dominica, is very small, only 2 or 3 millimeters long. And yeah, we know our temples well. So these, like their brethren, they actually bore into things, but they bore into products, stored products, especially whole grains, and they start to reduce the food's dust and hollow seeds. Thus, the dust is like the powder post that that it refers to these Bostrichids, the typical Bostrichids. Now, this is an interesting one. This beetle came from a huge colony of lesser grain borers that were in actually rat poison. So the rat poison is made of so that the rat poison is actually made of grains, and so it's attracted by them, and the rat poison doesn't affect insects. So they were pretty happy being in there. Now, to identify these, the adults have open antennal segments, much like the drugstore beetle, and they have a large prothorax that kind of covers the head and is rough, and then these bulging eyes. They also typically have a very blunt tip of the abdomen and very large pits on the elytra. And the larvae are C-shaped grubs, actually very similar to anabiids, and it may be that the anabiids are just a type of Bostrichid at some point, or vice versa. So what would happen if the rats eat them? Nothing. They'd get some little bit extra protein. Oh, they'd get a little extra protein before they died, of course, if they ate the poison, too. If they eat the beetles on their own, I'm not sure. I'm not sure what happens to the poison in the beetles. So I think it is what is left of a box of whole wheat type cereal. No, this is definitely poison, and they actually bored holes through the cardboard of the box to get to this, because again, these are a boring type beetle, not like a typical one. Okay, next group, the Tenebrionidae, the darkling beetles. So the two most common ones in stored products are red flower beetle and confused flower beetle, Tribolium castaneum and Tribolium confusum. These are actually genetic model organisms now because they have distinct differences, even though they're very closely related species, and their genomes have been now sequenced. So they can infest grains, but mainly like flour and damaged powder portions of the grains. So if you have something that's being attacked by the lesser grain borer that we just showed, and it's creating a lot of dust and extras that are coming out, these may also infest those parts. And so cleaning up the powder parts can help. The red flower beetle can fly, and the confused cannot. So that's one of the huge differences between them that is interesting to geneticists. Now, the red flower, the two can be distinguished, and these are both very small darkling beetles. Typically, like mealworms and larger darkling beetles are over a centimeter, maybe up to an inch even. These are very small, only about 4 millimeters long, 3 or 4 millimeters long. So the red flower beetle has a distinct club on the antennae, whereas the confused flower beetle does not have a distinct club. So again, anybody want to try and guess which species that is? Also, just to note, the confused has a little more angular pronotum and angular head than the red flower beetle. Okay, we've got confused, confused, confused. So nobody is confused because that is correct. That is the confused flower beetle. And it was called confused flower beetle not because they're typically not thinking straight, but because it's often confused for the red flower beetle. But now you shouldn't confuse them, so you'll know. Okay. Last of the beetles is going to be the Cuculionidae, the weevils. So there are a few species in the genus Cytophilus, especially the maize weevil and the rice weevil. These are small weevils. Again, most of these beetles are very small and brown, so that's why it's good to distinguish between them. Because if you look at them from afar, you might be a little, it might be a little tough. But looking at them closer, you'll see the distinctive characters. Of course, because this is a weevil, it's going to have a long snout and elbowed antennae. Telling the species apart is very difficult, so I'm not going to get into that right now. But they infest many grains, including maize, wheat, and rice, as well as other seeds and even sometimes other dry goods. They're even known to infest corn on the stalk out in the field. So they're not just sword pests, but they can be. And that's typically where people see them. They typically require whole grains, so they don't breed in flour. And what they do is they chew into the grain and lay eggs, and then the larvae feed inside kernels of corn and things like that. Okay, now the only moth I'm going to cover is the Indian meal moth, which is a pyralid moth. This is Plodia interpartella. Now there are several other pyralid moths like the almond moth, Angmoth grain moth, and a few others that will infest grains and stored products, but this is the one we commonly see. It infests many products including grains, dry fruits, nuts, bird seed. As you saw before in that container of nuts, there was a huge infestation in there, lots of larvae. And of course, because this is a moth, the larvae are caterpillars. So you can find prolegs with crochets, these long CD. Now they are paler than a lot of the caterpillars you'd find outside because they don't need to blend in with plants and such. They're going to be in stored products, of course. And because they're caterpillars, one of the main lines of evidence for knowing that you have an infestation of them is you've got a lot of silk and frass. So you're going to see the products clumped together in silk strands, and with a lot of, you can even see here, little bits of frass, little round pellets. Now the larvae, when they're ready to pupate, they're going to often leave the source and spread out. Oftentimes we found them climbing on ceilings and pupating in the corners and in the edges of ceilings. And they'll turn into a little amber pupa and then come off, and you may notice the moths flying around. And they're, classic little brown moth that's flying around in your kitchen. Could be a sign that there are infested products around. Okay. Are those eyes on the adult? Yes, these are the eyes of the adult, the antennae and the legs, and you can see they're actually a nice, pretty moth. I think they've got these coppery and black, gray, and banded colors. Now the other moths are close relatives, the almond moth and such. They're a little bit more uniform in color, usually a little drabber, gray or tan throughout. Are those the same as Miller moths? I would have to look that up. With common names, it's hard. I'm not sure. I don't recall offhand. I'd have to look that up. Maybe, I'm not sure. I can look that up when Mike is talking and see. But I'd have to see. Again, common names are tough. But this is typically and almost always called the Indian meal moth. Using the scientific name will get you a little bit further. Okay. Are these the ones found in pasta boxes? They can be, yes. So many of these insects, too, that I'm describing, not only infest grains and seeds and nuts, they will infest pasta, too. And they'll either bore holes in them or chew bits off of them. And so anything like that can be a food source for them. Okay, so the last thing, then, about them is just control of stored product pests. Now, typically, we don't spray or do anything for these stored product pests. The best things are, first, prevention. Keep the products in sealed bags or containers. This allows access to the products by the adults, which go lay eggs there. Here's a cashew, for instance, that's been covered in silk and frass, and here's a small Indian meal moth larva. Also, clean up spilled products. If you spill some, they get under, say, some piece of equipment or something, behind some boxes. That's a way for them to get into and start infesting the pantry. Also, dispose of or freeze infested products. This will kill whatever's in there. Most of them are not very mobile, so if you bag them up and put them in the freezer, you're going to kill whatever's there. They sometimes are coming from walls or chimneys. So this actually happens sometimes where rodents store seeds and nuts and things like that. And you may look in your pantry, you may find nothing contaminated, and you really don't know where it's coming from. Viewing where the most density of these insects is, it might help you identify where in the house they're coming from. The problem is if you can't access those areas, it may be difficult, and you may just have to wait for the cachet of the seeds and products to go away, to be eaten and used up. Otherwise, you'd be having to rip open your walls and things like that, and it's obviously more damage than is needed. Also, sometimes they're infested upon purchase from the store. So some people are saying, no, I have the cleanest house, how can this be? Well, sometimes the store had them infested, and you open the box and they're there. So again, difficult situations, but just getting rid of the food can really help. Okay, any questions before I move on to the last couple things? Okay, so one highlight, again, the emerald ash borer detections as of September 2015. Several counties across the state, not many in the south because it hasn't gotten there yet, are, oh, I've got a question. Do any of these insects serve any good purpose, or should I just squash all? The ones I talked about in the beginning of the talk, spiders, things like that, they can be pest control. I don't think squishing harmless insects and arthropods is really warranted. The pantry pests are, obviously a nuisance, and getting rid of the food source will help. They just really want to eat the things we like to eat as well. And again, it's up to you. I don't think spraying lots of chemicals is really necessary, but if you need to deal with the situation, you should really do so. And if you're having difficulties, calling a pest control operator is obviously a good option. What would happen? Okay, so thank you, Matt. Can you speak about silverfish? Okay, I was going to actually include silverfish. They are common in homes, and we have a few types. We have the common silverfish, and we have some of the larger ones. They also will eat lots of different things, including dead insects, hair, but also leather, glue, and whatnot. They are, another thing that's associated with just the bits and debris that are around our homes. So keeping, vacuuming up and everything could help. But they may just be a psychological nuisance, but they don't do any harm, except for, they may eat, like I said, wool products and things like that. I have kept silverfish in the lab and with some paper, and they actually chew on the paper, so they'll even eat just cellulose. And they're really hardy organisms, very primitive, hardy organisms. So again, it's up to your level of comfort with them, but they're typically harmless. Now, what would happen if one happens to eat one from a pasta box? Okay, so they really, the insects that infest these things can cause extra humidity and fungal growth, things like that. So it can be spoiled and it can smell bad. You probably would notice if it's that high level of infestation. If it happens to be a very small infestation and you eat one, you're not going to get sick. They're just typically, they're small insects that are going to get digested. And however disgusting that seems, it's kind of a fact of life that you may eat them occasionally accidentally, but they really don't carry any diseases or anything like that. Yeah, exactly. Mike said the insect is the worst end of the deal. Exactly. And in fact, I did have some dog food that was infested with grain beetles, the sylvanids. I ended up just feeding the dogs that, and they were fine. It's extra protein. It's not going to hurt them. So exactly. Okay, so if you have any other questions about that at the end, we can talk about that. Just the last couple of things. So emerald ash borer again detected in many counties, but the entire state is now under quarantine. Another interesting thing is that maybe since the last time we talked, the emerald ash borer has been found on an alternate host. We don't know how successful it is, but white fringe tree, also Oleaceae, has been known to harbor emerald ash borer, which makes me really sad because I love white fringe trees. And so we'll see how aggressively they attack them. But for right now, ash is the main host of them. So what does it mean that the entire state is now under quarantine? So the state quarantine rule is no movement of the beetles or larvae themselves. That's pretty obvious. No movement of ash trees, limbs, branches, stumps and roots, logs, lumber chips, and bark chips, because they can harbor these beetles. Or even any movement of firewood of any hardwood deciduous species, because we're not sure exactly. We hope that it's only a few species that it attacks, but there's always a chance that other Oleaceae and maybe some other groups could get attacked. It's probably not, but the fact that the white fringe was this new host is pretty surprising. Now here's the answer to one of the other questions, the follow-up, one of those pretest questions. So this is white ash right here, and Mike is going to talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes. I see one last thing. I get calls about wasps in the house when it warms up. Yes, so that's one thing. So right now we're also going to be seeing insects waking up from hibernation and going in the houses. This is to be paper wasps that overwinter. Many of social wasps, the queen will overwinter, and then when it warms up, they'll come out into the house proper. This also happens for a few fly species, ladybugs, and stink bugs, and a few other bugs. And I mentioned that usually in the fall that we're going to see them coming into the homes. This time of year, we're going to start to see them coming out of the homes. Okay, how is does quarantine no movement mean no movement out of quarantine area, no movement within the quarantine area? It's definitely no movement out of the state. The quarantine area, since it's the whole state, movement, we would have to look at the Forestry Service web page on the exact rules. I think moving within the state is all right, but it really isn't. You shouldn't be moving firewood anywhere right now, because those counties that don't have it need to help mitigate and keep the insect from showing up there. So we really don't want to move any firewood anywhere outside, especially the counties, and definitely not the state. And how is the movement of firewood controlled? By people supporting and by, honestly, I'm not sure what the Forest Service does, but if you are found moving firewood, I think there are fines and such. So, but I can find out a little bit more information about that. Okay, last couple things before I turn over to Mike. So the insect, be on the lookouts from March, April until our next session in late April. Okay, so fall cankerworms are always the subject to this time of year. We'll see how they are this year. Last year it didn't seem to be so much of a problem. This year I didn't see too many of the adults out on the buildings and such. Of course, the adults come out in the fall and winter, and you've got the wingless females, the winged males, equal babies. These are going to come out in late March, early April, and start to defoliate trees. And they're going to be these little green inchworms. The way to identify this species specifically is they have very small prolegs. The first pair of prolegs is very small, and then they have two other pairs of prolegs, like a typical inchworm. Another thing, the boxwood leaf miners. Now, this may be as late as May, but we see them in April once it starts warming up. You're going to see boxwood leaf miners, these little orange flies, hovering and swarming around boxwoods. Here's a female laying an egg. You can see a sharp ovipositor injecting an egg into the tissue. This is the best time to control. When you see the adults flying, that's when you'll want to spray the boxwoods with your select chemical. Of course, I'm not going to tell you which one, because that changes all the time. And so refer to your Ag Chem manual for the treatment. The adults are susceptible in landing, but once the larvae are in there, right here inside the plant, you can't control them really. You might be able to use, not sure if even the systemics will help with that. You'd have to look at the references on control of them. But the larvae grow throughout the year. They're one generation a year, so you will only see them once, the adults once flying around. And the rest of the year, the larvae will be living in these little blister galls in the leaves of boxwood. And this is a pupa of that, which you would see next year. Pruning is effective. Yes, that is true. So if you see these, pruning those out will, especially this time of year, you're going to keep those adults from emerging and affecting the plants. Now, you want to dispose of them well now. If it was earlier in the year or late in the summer last year, you'd be very effectively killing the larvae. Now that they're pupae, if you leave the leaves on the ground, say, there might actually be a chance that they'd still emerge from those leaves. And so you want to destroy them very, very well. Okay, scale insects. This time of year is when the scales are going to start to really balloon up and start to create eggs. The crawlers from last year too are going to move and start to settle. So you're going to start to see crawlers. So if you start to see very tiny little crawling scale insects around the scale-infested branches, that's the time to treat, because the crawlers are the most susceptible. So it's going to be, once it starts warming up, they're going to become more active. And lastly, just insects waking up from the winter. I described, there's a question about things waking up in the homes, but also outside. You're going to have the bugs, maybe the bugs, stink bugs and kudzu bugs are going to be waking up and start moving. But also you're going to get native bees. This photo I took in early April of last year, I think, or 2 years ago, in somebody's lawn. So you get a lot of these bees swarming. The ground nesting solitary bees are harmless, basically. They're not aggressive. And so, so look for these things. And ticks, yep, ticks will be around. They're around most of the warm parts of the year. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Mike now.
All right, thank you, Matt. So while Matt is going off and checking on the Miller moth common name, let's have you folks do a little game here. And 2 rules. One is that in order to submit an answer, I want you to raise your hand, and then that'll put a cue up as to who is first and second. So it's kind of like buzzing in on a game show. And you do that with the little hand symbol underneath your name in the participants list, at the top of the participants list. I saw that Nell had confused that for an applause symbol. Applause, by the way, can be found underneath the smiley face. If you click on the smiley face, it gives you other options there. But this is a raise your hand. So if you have an answer, raise your hand. Well, the question isn't yet, but when the question comes, if you have an answer, raise your hand, and then we'll take you in turn. And we'll do teams based on where you live. And for purposes of today, the prime meridian is going to pass through the J.C. Ralston Arboretum. So if you live east of the J.C. Ralston Arboretum here in Raleigh, then you're going to be on Team East. And if you live west of that line, you're going to be on Team West. So you have to, when you submit your answer through the chat, put down your answer and also what team you are on. With no further ado, this is a question, or the game called What Do Home Gardeners Submit the Most Of? And I have summarized the home ground submissions to the Plant Disease and Insect Clinic for the 3-year period from 2013 through 2015. The top 10 items are here, and we have I filled in 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10, and want you to fill in the others. So let's see here, the hands that are up. I see one hand up here, which is Lee County. So Lee County, please type in the chat box your entry. Okay, turf. I'm going to have to be more specific about that before we can see if I can figure out how to put the hand down here, lower hand. Okay, we have to have a more specific answer. Marshall H. Warren, Leland Cypress. Very good. Leland Cypress is in fact one of our most commonly received plants, and it is here as, Leland Cypress is number 2. Okay. So that was, let's see, Marshall, whose team are you playing for? So give us that in another chat if you would. And we move on to Ben, who had his hand up next. Let's see. Ben, azalea for west. Very good. That is number 9, the azalea rhododendron. If you take those together, that is number 9. So Team West then gets number 9. Next will be Deborah. Excuse me for if any mispronunciation here. Deborah Dupslaff Dillon. Let's see if I can find your entry here. Scrolling up and down. Deborah. Okay, Deborah, I do not see your. Oh, okay. So veg. Okay, be more specific than veggies, if you would. I want to get a little more specific than that. Our next hand raised is Dr. Gina Lynn Myers. Let's see, Gina's. If you would, Gina, enter your. Oh, you've already done so. Tomatoes. Yes, tomatoes is number 7. And Gina, are you playing for Team East or West? I don't know which side of the line you live on there. Okay, let's see. Gina, so we have number 7 was taken by Team East. Next in line as far as hand raised was Lee County once again. I'm going to ask you, Lee County, since there's quite a few items here that have been entered in the chat box, if you would go ahead and re-enter that so that I could see what you want to put in. Rosa for West. No, I'm sorry. Let's try and do this officially here. Roses are actually not in the top 10. I forget where they fell, but they were farther down than I expected. Okay, Christine Stecker. If you could please type in your fescue turf. Fescue turf. I'm sorry, fescue turf is not the next. Our next is Jane and Charlie Powell. Let's see. Jane and Charlie Powell, please type in your entry in the text in the chat box and whether you're playing for Team East or West. We still have 2 more spots to fill in here. And get ready, Durham, because you may have a chance next time. You will have a chance next because there'll be only 1 slot left, even if the Powells are correct. So, still waiting for Jane and Charlie Powell to enter their re-enter, if it's already been done, in the chat box what they think are either position 1 or 3, and which side of the line you're playing for. Okay. Since we're not seeing an entry from them, at least I'm not, I'm going to pass on now to Durham County. Sorry, Powells, but we're going to go on to Durham County here. If you would enter in the chat box now your entry. I'm taking people in order, by the way, from the hand raising. That's all I'm deciding here. Durham, Weed ID West. No, I'm sorry. No, I have not been counting strikes against teams here, but I probably should have. Go to Patricia A. in Guilford County. Azalea West. We already have Azalea Rhododendron as number 9 here. Alexander County. Oh, Hemlock, I see the Powells have chimed in. No, I'm sorry, Hemlock is not there. Let's see. Oh, I lowered the hand of the last person who I called on, and no, I don't remember who it was. Oh, it was Durham County. No, they had already said weeds. Okay, so I apologize if I skip somebody here, but we're going to Chris Alberti. Chris, what have you got? Lenton Roses East. No, not Lenton Rose. Abby Sutton. I should probably give some hints here. This is interesting because the number 1 has still not been chosen. Abby, yes, thank you. Number 1, Boxwoods, taken by Team East. Very good. And let's see, Lee County once again. Dogwoods, no, I'm sorry. Marshall Warren. Marshall, if you could type that in. Fire or ants. No, I'm sorry. Now, by the way, home and garden, number 10 there, is the category where things like ants and spiders get entered, but it is not. All right, I don't think we're going to get it, so I'm going to go ahead and put it in here. This would have been something that the folks farther east probably would have picked up on first, but in any case, Team East does have the win here, having picked out numbers 1 and 7 on the list, Team West with 9, and the missing item, number 3. Remember, someone had said turf, and I asked for more specific what turf. It is, in fact, if I can get things to clear here. Apologize for this delay here. There we go. Centipede grass. Or, actually I could have just gone 2 slides ahead here, and there's the full set of 10. So, oh yeah, I see Lee County to come up with it there. So a win here for Team East. Congratulations to them. You have bragging rights for the next 2 months until our next PPP. Unfortunately, that took a little bit more time than I'd hoped, but I will try and get through some other items in the next 11 minutes here, and then I know Lisa has some announcements. Also, oh, Marshall said, "Oh, I go to it." But since I was taking folks by order of the hand raising, that was why his correct answer was not registered earlier. And if I missed your hand being raised, then I apologize. The answer that Matt came up with here on the chat box, Matt, if you want to put that in again about the Miller moss, because it would be scrolling up quite a ways in the list there. I saw that you had entered something there. Let me look at the flip side of this very quickly here. The top finds on the other side, our database really isn't set up to answer this kind of question, but as an approximation, in those first 3 years, the things that we found the most in home ground samples were our, on the pathogen side, Phytophthora, which, as you know, causes root rot on a wide variety of plants. And we usually see it in woodies in the case of our homeowner samples. Rhizoctonia surprised me a little bit, but what pushed it up to the number 2 spot there was its importance in turf. So you've got large patch in centipede grass, and you've got brown patch in tall fescue, and that is really what made Rhizoctonia so popular. And third, Armillaria, which is our other important root rot in woody plants. We, even though these are the top ones, that doesn't mean they represent anything close to a majority. There's more diversity here than there is in an Iowa Republican caucus, and the total Phytophthora diagnoses are only less than 4% of the total identifications during that period of time, or samples. On the arthropod side, number 1, most frequent were the scale insects of different kinds. Number 2, the beetles, including the weevils, and number 3, mites of various sorts, so spider mites, fall spider mites, and so on. It's important to remember, though, that above and beyond any of these individual pathogens or groups of arthropods, it's the abiotic problems that are far the most common diagnoses. The high soluble salts, planted too deep, planted at the wrong time of year, cold injury, etc. So some of the things that actually Barbara Fair alluded to in terms of getting the right plant in the right place would go a long way to helping us with that. A couple of years ago, I did a presentation in PPP on things that you would see on bark, and I'm going to kind of reprise that a little bit, but with some new entries. This is a very interesting something that was observed on the bark of a crepe myrtle in Craven County this month. Photo provided by the client, whose name is being withheld here. And it turns out that my first thought was some kind of a lichen, but I got our big lichen book and didn't see anything that looked like this. We referred it to Dr. Alexander Krings in the plant biology department, who referred it to a friend of his, and it turned out that this was a liverwort. You can kind of see that lobed structure there to it and the branching pattern. I've never seen one like this, but likely this is a Frulania species. So observed there on crepe myrtle. How about this? If anybody wants to just go ahead and jump in, either type it on the screen or in the chat box. What is this? Red maple. Actually, this photograph was taken this morning. Yes, scale. Does anybody remember the particular scale that Barbara talked about in her presentation? Nope. Okay, this is gloomy scale. Yes, Allison, very good. Gloomy scale. I'll let Matt pronounce it. Melanastus tenebricosa. I do my best. And very common on red maples in stressed urban settings. Again, that was kind of a coincidence there that Barbara ended up talking about it as well. Sometimes you'll see some, not this little mite here that's crawling around, but sometimes you'll see some orangish exudations coming off of it, as here. There's a fungus that's often associated with these. Unfortunately, it's not a fungus that is going to give us control of the scale. Here are two examples of a bark find which were submitted this year already. The Japanese holly from January and this black gum from a nursery in the month of February, this month. And you'll notice these patches of either light or dark fungal growth on the bark. Does anybody recognize this? If not, it is, apologize for the poor contrast there, that is Septobasidium. So these are, there's actually several species involved. And the interesting thing about the Septobasidium fungi is that they colonize colonies of scale insects. So underneath that you would find the colonies of scale, and the treatment or the control for the fungus is actually by controlling the insects. Here's a picture a little bit brighter, showing some of the lighter colored ones, and these typically seen as felty patches. We usually see them this time of year, or at least seem to, because the leaves are off and allows us to get a better view of the bark. And they often are seen on very smooth barked plants, such as Nyssa, for example. This is a photograph that was sent to us, or two photographs, I kind of put them together, sent to us from a homeowner in Charlotte just yesterday in an email, who thought these were scales on the tree trunk, but in fact what these are fruiting bodies of a wood decay fungus. We'd want to look at the underside of those, and if it was smooth and not pored or porous, we would know that this was some kind of a sterium, which is a slash rotter killing wood that's already dead. So you can see that a large section of that tree was already dead. The question was whether or not they should pay the $800 that they were being asked to kick in to remove the tree, or if they wanted to remove, that's what they were going to be charged. And it's clear that there's a lot of decay in here. I think Chuck Hodges' formal recommendation is going to be that they wait and see what happens in the spring. The fact that there's a stump down here gives you an idea that there may have been some kind of a root rot going on, but this would not have been the cause of that rot. It's actually coming in on the dead wood. And speaking of wood decay fungi, this was around the corner from where I live. This, that should have been January, excuse me, not 24th February. I hope not. But there was a lot of damage during the ice storm in our part of the state, and even after those branches are cleaned up, there's still a lot of what we call infection courts. That's not where a judge sits and makes judgments about infections. It's a term that we use for where fungi, bacteria get into a plant. And those wounds created by the branches being broken, years down the road, we may be seeing wood decay, columns of decay inside trees that were invaded in those wounds. Stay tuned. Although it is destructive, you can't help but love the beauty of the ice on the trees, though. In this case, covering the twigs and the seed pods of a crepe myrtle. And our last what's on that bark picture, most of you should probably recognize this, something you would see on black cherries, wild black cherries, or on cultivated plums. And yes, then that is black knot caused by the fungus Apiosporina morbosa. Really, about the only control measure here is just to prune those out. I'm not a big proponent of sprays for disease control on ornamentals, but there is an exception, and that is roses. If you do have a susceptible cultivar of rose, then it's time to start the spray program when the leaves come out. And we're running out of time here, so I'll probably have to go into that in more detail later. But this refers back to our pre-test. And the first picture here is downy mildew, which is the one that you should have answered, because that is basically only a problem in nursery production, where the plants are crowded together. They're kept in very high humidity in the cool season of the year. This is a cool-loving organism, and we get downy mildew. I've only once seen it on a plant from a landscape, and it was one that had been recently purchased and installed. Black spot, of course, is, as the name suggests, identified by black spots. Typically, this fimbriate, this kind of feathered edge to the spot itself, often with yellowing and with leaf drop. You can also get leaf drop with Cercospora leaf spot on rose, and it is I'm thinking of a visit I did down to Edgecombe County, I think it was, earlier this winter, when their rose garden had, and depending on which cultivar you were looking at, it had both black spot and Cercospora leaf spot present. Very quickly, for your leaf spot control on roses, don't just rely on sprays. Be pruning out infected canes. You can get the black spot organism, the fungus, overwintering there. Also on fallen leaves, so either rake those out or add a layer of mulch this time of year. Prune your roses and other shrubs so that you have good air movement, good drying. Water so as not to wet the leaves. And going back to some things that Mark Wyndham told us about in his presentation 2 years ago, water at night so you're not extending that leaf wetness period into the morning or starting it early in the evening. Choose resistant cultivars when you are installing roses, and if you have a susceptible cultivar, be on a spray program starting from leaf emergence. A good reference for the lists of susceptible versus resistant roses is found in Chapter 3 of the Southeastern U.S. Nursery Production IPM book. And I'll type that quickly into the chat box so that you'll have it. In that we can find a large table, this is just a section of it, giving disease ratings for black spot, Cercospora leaf spot, and powdery mildew. So you notice in this case here, gourmet popcorn is susceptible to black spot, but resistant to Cercospora, whereas Happy Trails is the reverse, resistant to black spot and susceptible to Cercospora. So consult that for further information. We're out of time here, but the 2015 NC Ag Chem Manual in this table is the same as the 2016. It was not revised this year. Now that we have a new plant pathologist on board with responsibility for ornamentals, look for updates in the 2017 Ag Chem Manual. But in the meantime, here are some of the recommendations. The chlorothalonil is a good one. Another good one is not on here, but myclobutanil, which is very common in some of your household over-the-counter, so to speak, fungicides for the home garden. And I've even, my very limited personal experience with this is that copper soap is good too. You will not get good luck with baking soda or with some of the biologicals. With cease, for example, you would not get good control of black spot, at least from what I was able to determine. See if there was something else I wanted to mention there. Oh, that yeah, control for Cercospora would be similar than what would be for black spot. And when you're rotating, don't rotate myclobutanil, for example, with tebuconazole, because they're both in group 3. Finally, the answer to the question at the end of the pretest was that yes, boxwood blight does continue to be a problem. Just in, yes, it was last month, January 2016, we had the first detection, at least at the clinic here, of boxwood blight in a home landscape in the coastal plain. That was in Sampson County. So please keep vigilant about this. Looking for, we've talked about this before, the dark leaf spots, the dark streaks on green twigs, and defoliation as your main symptoms that lead you to consider boxwood blight as a possibility. If you think so, please do send it to us so that we can confirm that. Many things to keep watching for as temperature warms up. Spot anthracnose on dogwood, camellia petal blight. I have seen that this year. Last year it was very noticeably absent. The gymnospermgium rust on juniper, cedar apple rust and quince rust, entomosporium, we're still seeing that on our Indian hawthorns, and if there's any photinias left out there, phytophthora and armillaria root rots, of course, any time of year. Not too many veggies out there yet, but on the crucifers, be looking for sclerotinia stem rot, for black rot, and possibly downy mildew. Peach leaf curl on peach trees could be something we'll see, and of course, be sure to start your preventive stray programs for your fruits. In the flower bed, a little botrytis blight here and there, and maybe some black root rot of pansy and viola as the winter bedding plants get toward the end of their useful season. And in turf, fairy ring could be showing up as the weather warms up, especially if it's wet. Yellow patch, which is a disease I had not heard of until Lee Butler pointed it out to me. It can have similar symptoms to fairy ring. You'll notice it on the left there. Fairy ring, though, would have, for example, very dry soil under that ring. And spring dead spot, Bermuda grass, zoysia grass, as the warm season grasses start resuming growth. I know that was a little fast at the end there. Our post-test, very quickly.
Okay, so
Matt,
as we saw, A is Anthrenus. We've got A2. Adagenus, the black carpet beetle, is B1, and Trichoderma, C3, are the matching larvae to adult dermestids. Which one of these is Stegobium paniceum, the drugstore beetle? The right here, B, is that has the 3 enlarged segments in the tip of the antenna, versus the cigarette beetle, which is named Sericorni, which means saw-horned, which has the sawtooth, kind of.
What tree is this? As Matt mentioned, this is white ash, one of the ways we know ash from the possible lookalikes is the opposite arrangement of leaves. Now these are of course leaflets on a single leaf, but if you were to look at the leaves and the branches, they would have a pattern whereby they appear in pairs opposite one another. And there's a great mnemonic that I found online. I'm starting to like this thing called the internet to remember which trees have opposite arrangements, and it's MAD horse. MAD standing for maple, ash, dogwood, and horse standing for horse chestnut. So, and ash is one of those few trees out there where you will see an opposite arrangement of leaves. To distinguish it, for example, from a hickory that you might confuse it for in this case, that would be probably the main thing. Box elder would also have opposite leaf arrangements, but it would not have this many leaflets, and they would be more largely lobed rather than just small teeth on it, or smooth on the edge. So white ash, Fraxinus americana. A small trivia point, if you're trying to distinguish between the similar white ash and green ash, look at the bud scar, or the leaf scar, excuse me. If it's shaped like a D, the letter D, you have the green ash. So here, the D there. If instead it has a notch in it and looks more like the letter C, then you've got a white ash. And I put there two common for now ash species because unfortunately things do not look good with the now arrival of the emerald ash borer. And finally, witch rose disease, or no, second to final, witch rose disease is only serious in the nursery, at least in North Carolina. That was A, downy mildew. And certainly it is true that boxwood blight is still a problem in North Carolina. Before the announcements, let me ask quickly if there are any questions.
Do we want to find out how people did?
Maybe if they can tally that up for next time, because there are probably rooms with multiple people participating. And if you disagree with your grade, talk to Matt.
I'll tell you to talk to Mike.
All right, thank you for your attention and your extra patience today. Back to you, Lisa.
Thank you very much. I learned that I don't remember as much as I thought I did. So I appreciate those quizzes. And this is going to be really quick. So first of all, I've had a lot of questions about getting on the listserv, and so you can actually subscribe to the Extension Master Gardener Volunteer listserv by clicking on, following the link go.ncsu.edu/subscribe-emgv/listserv. So if you want to start getting emails about what's going on in the program, go ahead on there and get signed up. Okay, next. If you want more information or to find the links that end up being loaded up for today's session or other sessions, these are the two places that you would go. So there's go.ncsu.edu/PPP, or you can find it on ncsugarden.com. I think if you hit the advanced training at the statewide site, you'll find that link where you can go on and find some of those recordings as well. This is our schedule for the next session, which will be on April 26th, and I will make sure the link is available before then. So you will be getting those. We won't be doing the breakouts, and the next speaker will be Joe Neal in April. You should look for social media policy, which will show up as Appendix F, and the guidelines, which you currently have. You guys have all these. They've not put Appendix F up there now, but it's already been approved, and so it's just a matter of it being posted. If you need to have a copy of this, just let me know. Shoot me an email, and I'll be glad to send you what I've got, which will be part of those guidelines. In essence, what this is for you guys to as the volunteers are starting their Facebook pages or other social media efforts to extend outreach, it's a way that we can make sure that it's recognizable across the state and there's brand recognition and continuity. And so to make sure that the agents are sure that they're on those media accounts just in case volunteers end up leaving or going somewhere else, so that you still have access to those sites. And also there's a social media certificate that is out there that has been put together by the Extension Master Gardener Social Media Task Force, which is on eExtension, and so you can follow that link. The volunteers are supposed to contact their agents to make sure that they can do that for credit. Also, the handbook, from what I understand, the weeds section will soon be online, and I actually updated what we had before. So there's several chapters that are now online, and so I'm looking forward to more coming on. If you're interested in being more involved or helping out with the teacher's guide, you can get up with Kathleen Moore, and there is her email. And here are the guidelines, and so if you want to get more information on that, if you've not checked these out, that is the Go link that you can get to those guidelines. All right, Extension Master Gardener College is coming in 2017, and so we have our first meeting of the advisory team, and we've got about 13 people right now that are on this list, and I'll show you that in a minute. But coming end of May or June, the dates will be determined for about 3 or 4 days, which will have tours, etc., concurrent sessions, and keynote speakers. The room and board is actually going to be pretty reasonable, so the room cost will be between $26 to $29 for a double room, $36 to $39 for a single room. And then dining hall for the entire day of eating, this year at least, is set at $23.35, so that's pretty cheap for being able to come and stay for a few days and get some great continuing ed. There'll be online registration for all of that, which we will end up having set up. And we will be working out how the agent training will fit as far as that goes. And these are the folks that right now have said that they're interested in being a part, and so we probably have room for maybe a couple more. If you're interested, just shoot me an email, and the first meeting is supposed to happen on March 16th by Collaborate, and then after that we'll figure out how we're going to get together. Putting together leadership training for fall of 2016, and so I've brought this up with the agent management team, and this is something that will be offered to both volunteers and agents that have the Extension Master Gardener volunteer programs, and so I'm hoping it's going to be really inspiring and very helpful to those folks that are interested in leadership. And then this is one of the slides that I think that Lucy had put in, and so it is a place that you can also go to get some good information. She is leaving today, probably has left this morning, for Costa Rica, along with about 18 Extension Master Gardener volunteers. And so Lucy will be back on March 3rd, and so I'm hoping she's going to have a great trip. And I think this is the last slide. So Michael, I'm not singing.